Hi, it's Jane here. Just to let you know that this episode of the ITPro Podcast was recorded before the latest lockdown was announced. Now, here's the show. Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
And you're listening to the ITPro Podcast. This week, we're joined by staff writer and sometime co-host of the podcast, Keumars Afifi-Sabet, to talk about whether the COVID-19 pandemic has killed off the smart city dream. Keumars, welcome.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
So, smart cities have been a near-future vision for the past 5 or so years in the tech community. Urban landscapes with streets that flow with self-driving cars and smart public transport, IoT-enabled CCTV to not just monitor for crime and accidents, but to manage the flow of people as they go about their business. Smart billboards delivering targeted advertising, as well as alerts about local events, be that weather, traffic, entertainment, or other things, could be delivered to denizens' smartphones. Buildings, meanwhile, would have smart thermostats, smart lifts, smart everything.
One of the hallmarks, though, of the COVID-19 crisis has been an emptying out of city centres as office workers become home workers. For many employees, they've found working from home is suiting them quite well, while a number of businesses are either reducing their office space or giving up on the idea of a fixed workplace altogether, even post-COVID.
So, what will the lasting effects of the pandemic on how we live and work mean for smart cities, even after it's receded? We've seen a lot of discussion on smart cities over the last couple of years. What historically have been the main kind of features, if you like, or innovations that have been predicted to be the cornerstones of the smart city idea?
I mean, there's been a lot of sort of flying, car, moving walkways, implanted chips in our brains, that kind of stuff.
Real science fiction stuff.
Yeah, I mean, some of the kind of visions of this have been, kind of a bit closer to science fiction than science fact. But, the kind of more reasonable stuff, the more useful stuff for now is things like monitoring traffic, ensuring that you get a good flow of people, of cars, that kind of thing. Make sure that things run on time, update people to their phones if things are running differently, if there's been an incident, any of that kind of thing. Some things that are kind of filled in by certain apps currently, that kind of thing that would make life incrementally better, if you like. I mean, Keumars, have you seen anything that sort of really piqued your interest, or you think actually this is kind of useful rather than fanciful?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. You're totally right. It's been most of the quite, not the sexiest stuff in the world. Just making life slightly easier. I can think of a few things. I mean, for example, I suppose the closest thing we have to, as far as I can see, a smart city that's a bit more holistic than we've improved traffic flow is Hull's Smart City OS. So this is something that's been developed by a company called Connexin, and I think there's been a collaboration with Cisco too. Essentially, it's meant to be this central hub into which various disparate smart city projects will be fed into. So I think there are 12 at the moment, and they all feed into this central hub. So you have overview over everything that's happening that's connected to it. And I can give you a couple of examples. There's smart street lighting, and then there's a system that monitors the flow of people. But I suppose that when we talk about things like driverless cars and so on, it's not as if that won't be realistic in the future. I suppose at the moment it's just very difficult to see, considering there are so many hurdles to overcome by the time we get to that point. I think we haven't really necessarily done the basics well to then cast our minds to some of the more future-scaping things. I suppose things like data collection, we just need to get way better at collecting, processing, sharing data to even begin to realise our smart city dreams.
Yeah, and I think you've hit on a couple of interesting and important points there, whereas, city management, typically, it's a municipal thing. Now, it may be slightly outsourced by local government or city councils to private entities, but generally speaking, my bins are collected by my local city council, and I assume that's the same for most people. Services are run by them. And you kind of expect that to be the same for smart cities. If I've got something where my bin is being monitored by an IoT device, in order for somebody to come around and collect it, which seems incredibly inefficient, but I have also heard that proposed. You'd expect the council to do it, but smart cities as they are, it seems to be a lot of private initiatives that are not particularly coordinated, and it seems to be that seems wrong-headed a bit to me.
So when we think about smart city projects in the UK, I think it's very different to smart city projects in the US, I have to say. So you're right, there does seem to be this element of, in the public sector, we can't necessarily do a lot of the things that we would like to, because for whatever reason, maybe we don't have the budgets, maybe we don't have the technical expertise. But the way to actually get to that point is through public-private collaboration. Now, that's where you need oversight over what happens to the data, who has access to it. These kinds of terms need to be really, really watertight. I think when we talk about the US, we've seen examples of companies just bundle into cities, absolutely take over every single public service and implement lots of interesting technology. But then issues like privacy and what happens to people's personal data and so on, do they own it? I mean, does it belong to them anymore? Those kind of issues are sort of brushed aside. And I'm sort of glad that while there are lingering privacy issues with smart cities in the UK, we're nowhere near that level.
But I think it should also be noted that while government needs to have more of a role in, creating and shaping and administrating smart city projects, the government at large does not necessarily have the best record with adoption of tech innovation, digital transformation plans, that kind of thing. I mean, Silicon Roundabout was meant to emulate Silicon Valley, but in London, and kind of hasn't been, I think it's fair to say, the success that it was maybe intended to be as a kind of centre for innovation. And, the government itself doesn't have a particularly great record with tech adoption. I mean, they jettisoned the kind of remote House of Commons meetings pretty much as soon as they could in favour of going back into a very small, very close quarters chamber, which is, as we all know, absolutely fantastic for social distancing and whatnot. So I think any smart city project that has government involvement is going to be slightly held back by that.
Do you think hands might be forced, though, as they kind of were with the virtual commons while it was in action, that once we get to a point where governments, both national and locally, seem to be very into the idea of self-driving cars in particular? It really captured imaginations. If you have a sufficient quantity of those on the roads, especially if they're from different manufacturers, you're going to need some kind of overarching web to look after it. So is that the point where government is going to have to step in, where things, they're forced to, basically?
Well, no, I don't think they will, frankly, because look at electric cars. There are an increasing number of electric cars on Britain's roads. Electric cars are widely seen as, a very solid, very green method of transportation, and particularly of replacing traditional petrol-driven cars. But they need charging points. They need to be recharged, and they don't have as much of a range as traditional petrol-driven cars, which means they need to be charged more often, which means you need more charging points than petrol stations, quite a lot more, in fact, because whereas a petrol station can, refill a large number of cars at once, a charging point can maybe do two. And there just has not been any, sufficiently large national electric car charging infrastructure implemented in the UK. So I see absolutely no reason why the government would be any more keen to get what would be a much more demanding infrastructure and a much more complex and expensive infrastructure in place to support self-driving cars.
I was going to say, speak for yourself, London metropolitan elite, until you said nationally, because where I am, there are an increasing number of charging points, and, it's got to be proportionate as well. Once there are more electric cars, then there will probably be more charging points. But on that point, if we do get to a critical mass of electric cars, then the idea of a smart city would be to kind of go, okay, well, this is where there are free charging points, this is where there's not so many, and, that kind of thing. Once again, this more practical idea of a smart city.
But again, I think in order to get to that point, we'll need to put the basics in place. So, the data collection, actually conveying that to owners of these vehicles in a way that's easy, in real time and so on. I think these are all challenges that local administrations and central government need to figure out how they're going to overcome.
We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, we will be talking about the impact of COVID on smart city projects and whether or not they're even still viable in a post-COVID world.
See you after the break. Welcome back. Now, smart cities are predicated on there being a lot of people travelling around city centres, town centres, and COVID has kind of put the kibosh on that a bit. So, realistically, is it still worth pursuing the smart city dream and any smart city projects now, or is it just throwing money in the drain?
I honestly do think that COVID has actually accelerated demand for some smart city functions, and the best example I could give is public transport, because to some extent public transport will continue. I think that with more people going into work, especially places of work that you can't work remotely, then there might be a need to understand how busy certain services are and so on. So this kind of real-time data is crucial if you just want to avoid crowds, for instance.
Yeah, and I actually think that the reduction in the amount of workers in particular coming into city centres could be an accelerator for the adoption of these smart city programs, because when you have the kind of volumes of foot traffic and public transport traffic and just people moving around city centres that you had pre-COVID, that's very hard to cope with when you're just getting, what is a fairly new and cutting edge smart city program off the ground. Whereas if you have reduced numbers to cope with, it's a lot easier to get that in place and work out the kinks on a more manageable user base, if you like, and then scale that up as needed to cope with the increased numbers of traffic as people start to come back into the office, as tourism starts to open up again, that kind of thing.
And I think possibly a longer term sort of social consequence of COVID is that we will want to just in general do infection control a bit more. So not just for novel coronaviruses, but, say for flu or other, relatively serious communicable diseases. So...
And even non-serious ones. I mean, every year there's a cold that goes around pretty much every office in London within the space of 3 weeks. Not having to deal with that. I mean, it sounds like a small thing, but, imagine if we could reduce the spread of those kinds of illnesses that maybe only take people out of work for, a day or two at a time. But if we could half that, the productivity gains would be unbelievable.
Yeah, and my point being that you could try and drive people away from what looks like it might be becoming a crowded area, so you're more likely to have problems with disease transmission of whatever kind of disease it is that's in question.
Well, yeah, and there's also the laundry list of potential benefits that smart cities were built on kind of pre-COVID, the idea of being able to deliver more value to city residents and visitors through things like, intelligent offers and alerts on, events that are happening, and things like smart retail and all of this kind of stuff, and just more efficient civic infrastructure like public transport.
Well, I mean, you two seem very kind of positive towards this, and but to my mind, there's a problem as well with this. Is all very expensive. That is the reality of anything like this. So, is it worth implementing it if there's not a lot of the kind of benefits coming out of it? There's not that much traffic management to do, really. There's quite possibly fewer people to monitor and manage anyway, which means hopefully kind of less crime, fewer accidents, any of that kind of things that smart cities can theoretically help with. So for local communities, local government, I can't see that it would deliver the kind of return on investment that they would be looking for.
Maybe not in the short term. I think you're right. I think there are I can think of certain projects like smart street lighting, for example. You can possibly save on energy bills and so on. But I think if a local authority was going to implement that tomorrow, people would be like, "Why are you doing this now?" I don't think that's a priority for us, and I think that's true for a lot of these other. I hate to use this term, but more luxurious projects that perhaps aren't necessary right now, because there is a massive public health emergency, and I think you're right, it has set a lot of these kind of more exciting projects back a little, although there might be a good opportunity here to actually get some things done that could be useful and drive efficiencies for business. I mean, if people are more aware of what's going around their workplace, then I think everyone's going to be generally a lot happier that they don't have to miss out on however many days in a month during the autumn, or half their team might not necessarily be at home at any one time. So I think that could only be a good thing. And then if we kind of get that stuff done, we could probably start to focus on these other projects a lot more.
And it does look like one of the kind of lasting effects might be more people living in the suburbs and also working from home in these kinds of areas outside of city centres. So would smart suburbs be a possibility? And, what would that look like?
Well, I think the nature of smart city tech is that it's a lot easier to roll out in other places once you have successful test beds. For example, once you know how to successfully implement smart street lighting, for example, street lighting doesn't really vary that much from town to town, whatever size it is. So I think that kind of stuff is very, very scalable and very easy to transplant. Other smart city kind of measures like public transport are going to be harder because every town's public transport is going to be slightly different. For example, places like Nottingham and Manchester have tram networks, whereas London just doesn't. So I think some of the more, for want of a better word, basic measures can be rolled out in other places very, very easily. The question is whether or not there is enough value there in implementing them. Is there enough foot traffic? Is there enough, regular traffic? Are there enough challenges that smart cities can have an impact on to make the rollout worthwhile from a kind of cost and time investment perspective?
So smart street lighting, is this when the streetlights can detect when there are people in the vicinity and turn lights on and off as needed? Because that sounds like something from a horror film slightly.
I know what you mean. There's a picture I have in my head of you might be walking down the street and then maybe the lights in front of you and behind you are lit to some extent, but then you look back and then you see lights being lit maybe, I don't know, a few 100 feet behind you, and something's catching up with you. I kind of know.
That's horrifying.
maybe it's not such a good idea in retrospect.
I have heard like kind of safety concerns about these kinds of things, that actually, well lit streets are much preferable when it comes to reducing crime, because people can't just leap out of the shadows at you, because there are far fewer shadows to be leapt out from. So yeah, but this is always one of these things with whatever new technology you have to balance the benefits and the costs.
And I will tell you what, it is frightening, because we're all so used to street lighting. The other week, we were peering out of my front room window, and it was total darkness. There was, for some reason, there was a power cut or something, and all the street lights were off, and it was so disconcerting. It was really unsettling, because you're used to having this just nondescript light, but suddenly the entire street was shrouded in darkness. And I mean, we weren't outside, but I didn't want to go outside, because it's not that I'm afraid of the dark. I suppose you're just used to it. And I think people might not necessarily react in the best way if suddenly they're shrouded in darkness. It would take some getting used to.
Speak to yourself. I'm a country lass originally, although having, which I'm sure that listeners will be amazed to hear me mention that particular fact. But I have been living in an urban area for a while, so yeah, going back to complete darkness is a bit weird. So let's kind of re-angle a bit the idea of smart cities in the light of COVID. So could perhaps this kind of technology be used to create COVID secure cities? I hate that phrase, but I can't, that is the term. For example, say cubicles that you can quickly nip into for a test if you're starting to exhibit symptoms, or, sort of more wide scale temperature checking as you go into shops, or, slightly more big brothery as you go about your business. Is that a possibility as well?
Well, COVID has actually given us one of the very first steps in creating smart cities, in that COVID has forced us effectively to implement a wide-scale population movement tracking infrastructure in the form of the track and trace applications and frameworks. You can listen to our previous episode on COVID ups and downs for more information on that. But effectively, that allows city local governments to track the flow of people through, major population centres, major kind of tourist hotspots, that kind of thing, which is a kind of fundamental building block for the kind of smart city infrastructure that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I think on that, that's a really good point. We all hopefully by now have this app installed on our phones, and it's one of these things. It's really useful. It's quite straightforward in a way, but it's a big change for making sure our city centres, rural areas, wherever it might be, are as COVID secure as possible. But I actually have an example of a city that might, to some extent, already be COVID secure. And I think when we look back to the local lockdowns, particularly in the north of England, there was one exception, and that was Blackpool, because Blackpool, I think in that particular region, was the only area that wasn't under lockdown. And I think because to some extent it was made COVID secure out of necessity. It's a city that's hugely dependent on people coming in, on people from the area, as well as people from, all over the country. It's famous for its tourism and, so on and so forth. I remember going to Blackpool in July or so for the first time, and I remember seeing temperature sensors on the door to pretty much every arcade. There were hand sanitizing stations, so on and so forth. I think the technology is there, theoretically, and in this case, I think, to some extent, because you can't completely prevent a city from succumbing to the pandemic just by hiring some people with temperature sensors, because there's so much more to it. But I think, relatively speaking, for the amount that COVID was spreading at the time in that area, Blackpool did withstand that. And I think this kind of technology should be implemented a bit more widely in the UK to try and make sure that people aren't going into buildings when they have a temperature and so on, because these little things do help.
So quite a lot of what we've been talking about involves, we have the idea of policing by consent, and this is kind of technology monitoring by consent. And do you think that people will be on board enough with the idea to actually be like, yeah, sure, I'm happy to wander around while you zap my temperature with, smart cameras and, direct me in certain ways and that kind of thing? Or would there be too much of a rebellion against, the people who are supposed to be benefiting from this, in order to even get it to work?
Well, I think crucially, there has to be a way to opt out of some of the more, for want of a better word, invasive tracking mechanisms that are involved in running and operating a smart city. And I think if you don't have a way to opt out of those in the first place, then, well, they'll most likely be illegal as per GDPR and the UK's own Data Protection Act. But also, I think, we could see a lot of people going, no, actually, I am, I'm just not going to use public transport, or I'm not going to, use any of the other quote unquote smart infrastructure, because actually I don't like being tracked in this way. And because I don't have any way to opt out of the tracking, I just have to opt out of using the infrastructure altogether.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think personally, I would struggle to come to terms with a lot of these ideas if, for example, everything I was doing from the moment I left the house to the moment I came back was fed through some kind of sensor that processed that data. I mean, anonymously probably, but it would, just from a personal point of view, unsettle me a little bit. I think I'd come around, but I do think it's healthy to some extent to be skeptical of technology, especially when it comes to data, how it's used, what the purposes of that collecting that data are for. But I think if these issues are sorted at the time and the material benefits of these smart city projects come to fruition, then maybe I think people would come on board if they were previously skeptical.
Maybe. I'm probably the most conspiracy minded of the three of us and spend a lot of my spare time indulging that. But, I'd find it hard to swallow that in the same way that I was never particularly on board with the idea of ID cards. And, I think any of us who are parents would definitely feel a reservation about our children being submitted to this kind of tracking. I think it would be hard in some ways for this to work out in a kind of public health and safety type way, purely because people don't like to have their privacy invaded, especially when the benefit is slightly ethereal. On the other hand, if the benefits are very obvious, very immediate, and the intrusion levels are low, and, say you can opt out of anybody under the age of 18 in particular, are default not involved, then I think, people, even me included, might be more inclined to get on board with this.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for this week, but thank you once again to Keumars for joining us as our guest.
Oh, and thanks for having me.
You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in our show notes, and even more on our website, itpro.co.uk.
You can also follow us on Twitter, where we are at ITPro, as well as Facebook and LinkedIn. Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro podcast wherever you listen, and if you could leave us a rating and review, that would really help your peers and colleagues find us.
We'll be back next week with more from the world of IT, but until then, goodbye.
Bye.
The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.